Imagine waking up to discover that everyone you have ever known has vanished. Not gradually. Not through some natural drift of time. But in a single afternoon, aboard a ship that disappeared into fog and never returned. Now imagine that this is not a nightmare you can escape, but the beginning of nearly 2 decades lived in absolute solitude, on a windswept rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This actually happened. And the woman who lived through it may be the most remarkable survivor you've never heard of. The year is 1835. A small wooden vessel rocks violently in churning waters off the coast of San Nicolas Island, 61 miles from the nearest point of California. On board, frightened men and women clutch their children and their meager belongings. They are the remnants of the Nicolino people, indigenous inhabitants of this desolate island for thousands of years. Now, after decades of Russian fur traders bringing disease and brutality to their shores, only a handful remain. Catholic missionaries have arranged their removal to the mainland, ostensibly for their own protection. The operation is rushed. A storm is building on the horizon. The captain shouts orders. People scramble across wet planks, their feet slipping on seaweed-slicked wood. And in the chaos, in the panic, in the desperate rush to escape before the weather turns lethal, something goes terribly wrong. When the schooner finally pulls away from the island, fighting the rising swells, one person is left behind. The accounts differ on exactly how it happened. Some say she leaped from the boat at the last moment, searching frantically for a child who had wandered off. Others claim the crew simply miscounted in the confusion and sailed without realizing their error. What cannot be disputed is this: when the vessel vanished beyond the curve of the earth, a single woman stood on the beach, watching the only other members of her tribe disappear forever. She did not know it yet, but she would not see another human face for 18 years. Her name has been lost to history. The world would later call her Juana Maria, a Spanish name bestowed by missionaries after her rescue, but the name she carried in her own language, the name her mother gave her, the name spoken by her people for generations, died with her unrecorded. What remains is not a name, but a story of endurance so extreme it challenges our understanding of what the human mind and body can withstand. San Nicolas Island is not a paradise. It is 7 miles of wind-blown rock and scrub brush, shaped more by violence than beauty. Gales tear across its surface almost constantly, bending vegetation into permanent submission. Fresh water is scarce, limited to seasonal rainfall collected in shallow depressions in the stone. There are no forests, no rivers, no natural harbors. Cliffs rise sharply from beaches of coarse sand and jagged rock. The landscape offers almost no shelter from the elements. In winter, storms hammer the island with rain and freezing wind. In summer, the sun bakes exposed surfaces while fog rolls in without warning, blanketing everything in cold, gray dampness. This is the environment she would call home for the next 2 decades. But the ocean surrounding the island tells a different story. Beneath the surface, kelp forests sway in underwater currents, their golden brown fronds creating a 3-dimensional maze that shelters countless forms of life. Fish move through these forests in shimmering schools. Abalone cling to rocks in the intertidal zones, their shells catching the light. Sea otters float on their backs, cracking shellfish against stones balanced on their chests. Seals haul themselves onto beaches to rest and breed. The waters around San Nicolas are among the richest in the Pacific. For someone who understood the rhythms of the sea, who knew when and where to find food, survival was possible. Barely. She may not have been entirely alone at first. Some historical accounts suggest that a young boy, perhaps her son, was with her on the island for a brief time after the ship departed. If these accounts are accurate, the child likely drowned attempting to navigate rough surf in a makeshift canoe. We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that at some point, perhaps immediately, perhaps after a devastating loss that compounded her isolation, she was utterly, completely alone. No one to speak to. No one to share the burden of labor. No one to confirm that she still existed. The silence must have been crushing. Most people would not have lasted a month. She lasted 18 years. How? The answer lies in knowledge, in the accumulated wisdom of her people, stored in her memory and expressed through her hands. The Nicolino had survived on San Nicolas for millennia not through luck, but through expertise, through intimate knowledge of every edible plant, every reliable water source, every seasonal shift in animal behavior. She carried this knowledge inside her, and now she would test it against conditions no one was ever meant to endure. She built shelters. Not crude lean-tos, but carefully constructed dwellings designed to withstand the relentless wind. One of her most extraordinary creations was framed with the massive ribs of a beached whale, bones bleached white by sun and salt, arching overhead like the skeleton of some ancient cathedral. She filled the gaps with driftwood, woven grasses, packed earth. The structure was ingenious, low to the ground to avoid the worst of the gales, positioned to capture warmth from the sun while blocking the prevailing winds. She built other shelters as well, lighter structures that could be relocated depending on the season, each one a calculated response to the demands of the environment. Clothing presented another problem. Fabric was impossible to obtain. Thread, needles, buttons, all the tools of civilization were absent. So she created garments from what the island provided. She hunted seabirds, carefully plucking their feathers and stitching them together with sinew to create insulated layers. She took seals on the beach, skinning them with stone blades and curing the hides through techniques perfected over generations. She fashioned needles from bone, shaping them with abrasive stones until they were thin enough to pierce leather and flexible enough not to snap. Every stitch was laborious. Every seam represented hours of painstaking work. When archaeologists later examined artifacts she left behind, they were struck by the craftsmanship, the precision, the intelligence embedded in every object. Food required constant attention. She harvested mussels and abalone from tidal pools, timing her gathering to the phases of the moon and the rhythm of the tides. She caught fish using lines and hooks fashioned from bone and shell. She hunted birds when they nested on the cliffs, collecting eggs and taking the adults when necessary. She pursued seals, a dangerous task even for multiple hunters, using techniques that required patience, timing, and nerve. She dried meat in the wind to preserve it for leaner times. Nothing could be wasted. Every scrap of fat, every fragment of bone, every internal organ had a use. Waste meant hunger. Hunger meant weakness. Weakness meant death. Water was perhaps her greatest challenge. San Nicolas receives little rainfall, and what does fall must be captured immediately or it vanishes into the porous ground or evaporates in the sun. She likely collected rainwater in natural depressions worn into the rock, returning to these sources again and again, rationing every drop. She may have fashioned containers from seal stomachs or woven baskets sealed with plant resins. Dehydration would have been a constant threat, a slow killer that weakens the body and clouds the mind. She could not afford mistakes. But the physical challenges, as brutal as they were, may not have been the worst of what she faced. Humans are social creatures. We are wired for connection, for language, for the presence of others who acknowledge our existence. Remove that, and the mind begins to fracture. Studies of extreme isolation, of prisoners in solitary confinement, of explorers cut off from their teams, reveal a pattern of psychological deterioration. Hallucinations. Paranoia. The erosion of the sense of self. Many people in far less dire circumstances have simply surrendered, choosing death over the unbearable weight of being unseen. She did not surrender. Instead, she fought back with the only weapons available: ritual, routine, memory. Evidence suggests she sang regularly, songs from her culture, carried forward in her voice alone. She spoke aloud, narrating her actions, conversing with animals or spirits, or simply affirming her own existence through the sound of her own voice. She marked the passage of time, carving notches into it or arranging stones in patterns that only she understood. These were not the behaviors of someone descending into madness. They were acts of defiance, small but profound declarations that she was still a person, still part of a culture, still tethered to meaning even when meaning seemed impossible. And so the years accumulated. 5. 10. 15. The island changed around her in small, incremental ways. Bones she had discarded became scattered by wind and scavengers. Shelters she had abandoned crumbled back into the landscape. Tools wore down and were replaced. The woman herself changed too, her hands growing rougher, her body leaner, her movements more efficient. But inside, in the architecture of memory and identity, she remained who she had always been. The last living speaker of her language. The last keeper of her people's stories. The last witness to a way of life that had existed for thousands of years and would die with her. On the mainland, the world moved forward without her. California transitioned from Mexican to American control. Gold was discovered in the Sierra foothills, triggering a massive influx of settlers. Ships crowded the harbors. Cities grew. And 61 miles offshore, on a barren island that appeared on maps but existed in no one's thoughts, a woman continued her invisible work of survival. In 1853, 18 years after her abandonment, a sea otter hunter named George Nidiver heard persistent rumors of signs of life on San Nicolas Island. Intrigued, and perhaps sensing an opportunity for salvage or discovery, he organized a small expedition. When his men landed on the island's rocky shore, they found immediate evidence of habitation. Shelters, both occupied and abandoned. Tools scattered near a fire pit. Dried fish hanging in the wind. But no person. They searched for hours, calling out, scanning the cliffs and beaches. Nothing. They prepared to leave, assuming whoever had been there had perished or moved on. Then, on their final night, as they sat around a fire on the beach, she appeared. She had been watching them, silent and cautious, assessing whether these strangers represented danger or deliverance. When she finally approached, she carried a gift, wild onions, roasted and still warm. It was a gesture that transcended language, an offering of hospitality, of connection, of shared humanity. Communication was nearly impossible. No one in Nidiver's party spoke her language. She spoke nothing they recognized. But understanding flowed between them nonetheless, carried in gestures, in expressions, in the universal grammar of kindness. One member of the crew later recalled that she sang for them, a song in her native tongue that he described as hauntingly beautiful, expressing something he interpreted as contentment, as readiness. After 18 years of isolation, she chose to leave. She was brought to Santa Barbara, into a world that must have seemed utterly alien. The noise alone would have been overwhelming, voices layered upon voices, animals, machinery, the constant hum of human activity. She lived with Nidiver's family. Curious visitors came to see her, this woman who had survived the impossible. By all accounts, she displayed remarkable composure, examining the objects and customs of civilization with curiosity rather than fear. Horses fascinated her. She studied buildings with the eye of someone who understood shelter intimately. She accepted food with gratitude but no desperation. She did not complain. She did not weep. She simply observed, adapted, continued. But her body, honed for survival and deprivation, could not adapt to abundance. Within weeks, she fell ill. Her digestive system, accustomed to a narrow diet of lean protein and seasonal plants, rebelled against the variety and richness of the food she was offered. New bacteria, new pathogens, microorganisms her immune system had never encountered, overwhelmed her defenses. Dysentery is the most likely culprit, a cruel irony, killed not by starvation or exposure but by plenty. 7 weeks after her rescue, she died. Before the end, a Franciscan priest baptized her, giving her the name Juana Maria, the only name by which history would know her. She was buried in an unmarked grave at the Santa Barbara Mission Cemetery, laid to rest among strangers because no one could understand her language well enough to record her final words or wishes. The objects she had crafted on the island, the tools and clothing that represented nearly 2 decades of labor, were collected and sent to museums. Many were destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the fires that followed. Among the lost was a dress made entirely of cormorant feathers, a garment so extraordinary it was sent overseas for study and preservation. It vanished. No one knows where. For generations, her story existed mainly in local records and fading memories. Then, in 1960, Scott Odell published Island of the Blue Dolphins, a fictionalized account of her life that introduced her survival to millions of readers. Decades later, archaeologists returned to San Nicolas Island and confirmed the truth beneath the myth. They found the whale bone shelter. They found stone tools, food remains, layers of ash from countless fires. They found proof that she had lived not as legend, but as fact. Her story refuses easy interpretation. It is not a tale of triumph in any conventional sense. She did not overcome isolation through clever escape. She was not rewarded for her endurance. She survived 18 years alone only to die 7 weeks after rescue. There is no moral victory here, no redemption arc, no justice delivered. What remains is simply this: a human being, stripped of everything except knowledge and will, chose to continue. Day after day, year after year, in the absence of any witness or promise of rescue, she chose to live. That choice, repeated in silence for 18 years, stands as one of the most profound acts of resistance ever recorded. Not resistance against an enemy or an ideology, but resistance against erasure, against the terrible gravity of despair, against the seductive ease of simply lying down and letting the wind cover you with sand. She refused. And in that refusal, she becomes something larger than herself. She becomes evidence of what we carry inside, the unbreakable core that persists even when everything else is stripped away. The island is still there, 61 miles off the California coast. The wind still tears across its surface. Seals still haul out on its beaches. And somewhere beneath the earth, in layers of ash and bone and scattered stone, the physical traces of her life remain, waiting to remind us that survival is not always loud or heroic or public. Sometimes it is quiet, invisible, a private war fought in the space between one breath and the next. And sometimes, that is enough.